Right, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Prasanna back to William Osler House. I first knew Prasanna 20 years ago when he was a clinical medical student here. He acted in Tinchwick 3 years in a row and directed Tinchwick, and it was quite clear that he had great thespian abilities then. The greatest pleasure for any teacher is to see students flourishing in their subsequent career, even if they don't arrive. And so I've been enjoying following Prasanna's career as an actor, writer and director. Many of you would have seen Prasanna. He keeps popping up on television, whether in Patrick Melrose, for example, or I suppose most famously as Martin Bashir in The Crown. But Sally and I have also very much enjoyed seeing Prasanna on stage. We saw him opposite Jude Law in the West End in Henry V some years ago. And 10 or 12 years ago we saw Prasanna at the Royal Shakespeare Company in Twelfth Night as an actor. And now the directing career has been pretty active for the last 5 or 10 years, but Prasanna is now directing Twelfth Night at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and if any of you want a really good Christmas show, then I can thoroughly recommend it. It's the funniest Twelfth Night I've seen, and I've seen a lot of Twelfth Nights, but it's also a production that's very sensitive to all the rather complex relationships between the various characters. So it's my great pleasure on behalf of all of us to welcome you, Prasanna, to your talk on driving without arriving, careers as a journey and not a destination. Thank you, Prasanna.
Afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Tony. It's really lovely of you to say. Yes, I've not been in this building for about 20 years, and it's really you get to a point in your life, don't you, where you start talking in multiples of decades, and it gets very alarming. But this was a sort of whitewashed post-war building when I was here, with a huge garden, and the garden's been amply encroached upon by these two buildings, which is really nice, and I think the medical school is lucky to have it. It was a lovely building then and seems really lovely now, but it's weird to be back here after 20 years and to discover there's a Marks and Spencer's. We were blessed with a Londis back in the day, which kept us going on those long nights. So yes, I'm delighted to be here after 20 years, which have been an interesting time for me. And I don't think anything that I'm going to say about careers is going to in any way be earth-shatteringly original, or even potentially all that interesting. But I think it's an intriguing moment for young healthcare professionals and doctors in training as the challenges of the health service bite, and young people feel the pressures very keenly in all sorts of ways. The thought of escaping through a side door, I think, looms quite large in their minds. And I think it's a challenge for their senior colleagues to hold and support, but fundamentally to understand why that might be. And like any sort of act of parenting, to try and find a way to let the life that's going to happen anyway happen. So yes, I'm an actor, a director and a writer, former doctor, except when people discover bumps on their children's faces and things in the middle of the night, and I get texts from acting colleagues, photos of various body parts, which sends me heading straight for Google, as I'm sure it does many of my colleagues in the service. We have a bit of an echo. Sorry. It's all right. It's all right. So these are some of the things that we'll talk about. I don't know what the current form is we were told absolutely you must never use bullet points in your PowerPoints. So feels appropriately transgressive to use some here. But we can talk about coming into medicine and leaving medicine and some of the work that I've done, but more interestingly maybe some of the connections between the two spaces and some of the weird resonances that have occurred between the two halves of my professional work. Before thinking about what a career is in the most existential way, and is it even worth wondering that? Let yourself be silently drawn by the strange pull of what you really love. It will not lead you astray, says Rumi. Interestingly, that isn't why I became an actor. It wasn't what I really loved, it was, as we'll talk about in a second. It's become what I loved, what I love, but it's become that through a sense of arrival and peace and calm and centeredness, rather than a decision that I made when I was 5, for instance, that I really must tread the boards, and subsequently got waylaid. It was a very late discovery for me. Remember this image. We'll see it again. Remember its unmistakable NHS whiteboard vibes. So recently I was asked to be a Dummett Visiting Fellow at New College, which was an inaugural post set up following the death of Michael Dummett, the philosopher, to try and assist undergraduates, and to a certain extent actually the SCR as well, with questions around the way that a college at this university plugs into the wider world, or the rest of the world I should say, particularly at the interface of career commencement. And how strange a space that can be for graduates at this point in the evolution of the world, where opportunities thin and the future looks further away. We're no longer in Blair's Britain, which is the environment in which I emerged as a student, where the roads were well tarmacked, literally and figuratively. So here I am, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and with Peggy. This is an undoctored film photograph. Cast your minds back. This is just an artifact from being in a camera for too long, or the film being overexposed in the red spectrum. Anthony Gaglione, any of you will know, Professor of Pharmacology. And Professor Trevor Powell, Professor of Cardiovascular Physiology. Jonathan Lightfoot is now consultant anaesthetist. Kelsey Jones is a research paediatrician, very distinguished one actually. And Sarah Hargreaves is an oncologist in the west of England and in Wales. And I joined the circus, so it's an interesting quartet. But it's been an interesting thing to return to college as a Dummett Fellow and consider that time and what we all thought was happening and what we thought was going to happen, and how the rails were laid in front of us as our wheels hit them. And actually a lot of decision making was taken away from us because we just knew that at some point down the line we would retire. All the time I was doing plays as a student. I joined the National Youth Theatre just before coming up to Oxford, having discovered a year before, I think, in the middle of my sixth form, that I enjoyed the treehouse building of making a play, the shared activity of it, the glimpse of being another life, which was intriguing. I didn't come from a particularly cultural background. I avoided reading, I avoided plays, I enjoyed sports, I enjoyed watching cartoons about science fiction, and I played a lot of video games. I was that kid. So discovering that theatre was actually something that I found quite interesting and intriguing was a surprise to no one more than me. And I discovered that people had come to Oxford solely to do theatre, and were doing degrees almost as part-time students as they trod the boards 4, 5, 6 times a term in various plays. And I could never get cast in anything decent in terms of roles, which suited me quite well. I remember vividly Prof Morris writing an essay about the rotator cuff of the shoulder in the dressing room of a production of Richard III in which I was playing Catesby, a man who was barely on. But that was enough for me. It was an interesting way to spend my time, and it was an interesting way to meet other people, and to try something that was, at the time, profoundly unmedical. Although I discovered as I went along that actually the reason that I'd been drawn to it, I think, and been drawn to medicine, was that both of them sat weirdly close on this Venn. And the Venn was something to do with the relationship between the decoding of a set of circumstances and placing them in a present tense context. And any piece of acting is fundamentally that. You work out what has led a person to a moment, then you add the thing that has just happened to them or just been said to them, and that informs you what you would then do. That would be the next thing that happens. Acting is reacting, people say. The best thing you can do as an actor is to not have to do any acting, because everything has just been made clear. And if you think about it, that's how we live our lives. We live in the context of the lives that we've lived up to a point, colliding with a set of present circumstances. That's just what being alive is. And I guess that's sort of the diagnostic process as well, particularly in areas of medicine where you're dealing with long-term illness. You're dealing with complex things arriving in the present and articulating with the present moment. And the job is to work out what is happening at that bleeding edge, which you've all made a career of. So I guess that kind of live nosiness was the shared space. Also, they're both, in some senses, social sciences. Acting is a social science. It's a social science in the third dimension. So it wasn't wildly out of the bell curve. And actually you find a lot of people who are doing all manner of things away from medicine where you can quite clearly see the intersectional spaces. I know a lot of actors who used to be doctors. There's a lot of them out there, which is quite interesting. But I used to go to the RSC quite a lot. So I used to go up there when I was a first year junior doctor, get £5 tickets on the day with my student card, which had expired, but I sort of covered the thing up with my finger. Apologies if the RSC is watching this. I had directed a production of All My Sons at the Oxford Playhouse that had been seen by an agent from London, who rather confusingly told me that I needed to really consider my future and I needed to really think about directing plays. I said, well, I'm just about to start obstetrics and gynecology, so I don't think I'm going to be thinking about plays for a while. So off I went to Banbury to do that. I then got a part in the Raj Quartet by Paul Scott, which was a Radio 4 adaptation over 9 episodes through the National Youth Theatre. I got this audition. I went down. It was a bewildering experience. Bush House on Aldwych. And I think they were, and this is not in any way false modesty, they were truly short of people. And I know that because that's when you start looking at the National Youth Theatre, or certainly back then. So that was a job that I did just before Tindrick and finals of the sixth year. I went down on the Oxford Tube, I think over a period of about 15 days, and I revised on the bus on the way down, did the recording during the day, revised on the bus on the way back, and then did rehearsals for Tindrick in the evenings. which was a bit insane. But it was very interesting, and I enjoyed the weirdness of it, actually. The kind of the sense that I was making up the professional journey as I went along. But most importantly, that I wasn't saying no to an opportunity, that I was trying to find a way to make it work. So I did F1 and F2 in there. And unusually, I did 24 months in there, in JR2, 24 months in the big building. Which was really interesting, because it's there was no shortage of people saying, well, no one ever does a whole year as an F1 in the John Radcliffe. You must be very distinguished. And I wasn't. It was the first year of MTAS. It was a sort of, it was as much a quirk as anything else. But it was a horribly compressing experience for 24 months. And I think often you sort of spend 6 months and then you go to Orkney or you go to anywhere, Swindon, somewhere. The change, the decompressive change, can be the thing that helps you reset your dials. You know, a bit of fresh air, a walk on the downs, something. It's hard in there, I think. So F1, F2 was a sort of ramping, quite punishing experience. And as the system tipped over into working time directive, compliant rotas, while nothing else really fundamentally changed, we just found ourselves working the same hours as our immediate predecessors, just under different contractual circumstances. Again, weirdly, I applied for the acute critical care STEM and reconstructive surgery, which made sense at the time. I can't quite recall why it made sense at the time. I didn't particularly want to be a surgeon. I was interested in cleft lips and palates from my elective in Cambodia. So that was what I wanted to do. But then I thought it's quite hard to get into plastic surgery, so I should probably put something else that I enjoyed doing, and I enjoyed general medicine and acute medicine. It was a nasty thing to have to explain in interviews why I was sort of spread betting in this way. But I managed to get a run-through job in plastic surgery in the John Radcliffe. And there was something about that after 24 months in the John Radcliffe that felt quite difficult to imagine. Another 8 years, and I just didn't quite know how to say yes to it, you know. And the truth is I was struggling a bit. I was coming back from night shifts, trying to stay awake. You know, I'd drink a can of John Smith's and watch an episode of 24 at 10 in the morning to try and stay awake, because I knew that if I went to sleep, I'd wake up at midday before I went back in for another 15-hour shift at 6 p.m. or whatever it was. And there was a growing constellation of features that made me think that this was going to be quite a challenge, I think, for me. But I remember talking to Rachel Clark, the very distinguished palliative care doctor of yours, who was a student of mine, actually, and we'll talk about Rachel later on. And Rachel said this to me about 6 months ago. She said, I remember you being this capable, confident young doctor. You always seemed so assured. I mean, talk about adaptation. I think we probably all felt that feeling that you've got to front up. Not only for your colleagues, but certainly for your patients, when everything inside is at one level kind of falling apart. And it happened so sort of completely, I think, really, for me. So I spoke to the deanery and I asked them whether I could come back after a year to do this plastic surgery job. And they said, yes, you can come back, but it won't be plastic surgery. It'll be a surgical post of some sort. Yeah. And I said, fair enough, great. And I left and I moved onto my older sister's sofa in East London. She lived on the Isle of Dogs, which is just south of Canary Wharf. And I immediately felt better. I felt the sky was bigger. It was like when I left Twitter. the world just became the world again. And I did a bit of locoming, and I had a hold all of clothes and an old Le Creuset pot that I found in a rental on the Cowley Road. And I travelled around the south of England doing ENT posts and doing jobs that were always longer than a week because I wanted to stay and in bed. And I really loved it, mainly because I knew that each job would finish, which was another clue. And eventually I got an acting job. I got an audition from that same agent who'd heard that radio play and said, "Oh, I'll put you up for some acting jobs here." Through this door was a theatre called the Arcola, and this is in Dalston in East London, and believe it or not, was one of the most significant theatrical environments about 20 years ago in London. It's now moved somewhere else, and like a lot of spaces in the Fringe are kind of peripatetic and temporary. But I got a job in there, and it was a production of Thyestes by Seneca, to which the casting department of the National Theatre and the Royal Shakespeare Company attended. And I went back to do my final locum job in Eastbourne. And while I was in Eastbourne, I came up to London to audition for a production of Twelfth Night. And I got the job, and that was the last medical job that I did in Eastbourne. And it was 15 years ago, this August. And then I went here. And this is the old Courtyard Theatre at the Royal Shakespeare Company. It's a temporary building built inside a metal frame and Corten steel, harbour steel. They built it in 1 year for £6 million. It was a phenomenal feat of architecture. While they refurbished their old Art Deco cinema cum theatre that is the main stage at the Royal Shakespeare Company. This is one of the best theatres I've ever worked in. I played a Greek Orthodox priest, fake beard, full blacks. I got called into the foyer one performance because it's a tin box. There was a double door somewhere just off to the side that just takes you into the foyer. There was no corridoring or complex circulation. And a patron had been taken out, and she had ovarian cancer and had recovered from a round of treatment, and her family had taken her to the theatre to celebrate. And of course, under the lights and the humidity, it was all a bit much. So her family, very concerned family, large family, 8 or 9 people, various ages, had pulled her out. And I got a call from stage management just saying, could I come to Prompt Corner? And I arrived. And they went, patron's taken ill, we know you're a doctor, would you go and have a look? So I wandered out. So imagine the sight, you're at the Royal Shakespeare Company and your loved one is taken ill and a priest appears. And she woke up and she looked at me and she said, God, it's a very good service here, isn't it? And I said, you're fine, your brain is perfusing very nicely. I think you need to get back in to see the show. So it was a weird kind of early collision of the two jobs. But it was interesting that an early place of decompression for me, the Royal Shakespeare Company, became my first workplace. And so it sort of imprinted as this safe landing zone for me. And I've loved it ever since, really. And I then worked at the National Theatre for 2 years with an annual conversation with the surgical dean to say, I don't think I'm going to come back this year. And the surgical dean would say, that's okay, don't worry about it, come next year. And all the time sort of hoping that they would say, sorry, the door's closed. And then eventually I said, look, I'm going to cut the cord here myself. And if I want to come back, I'll just reapply. And he said, don't worry, come back whenever you like, and we'll give you a job. And I said, no, these are not the These are not the helpful soundings of a... but it was incredibly supportive, and actually many of my consultant colleagues, Martin Burton and Tim, who I think is here. Are you here, Tim? There you are, Tim. Yes. Hey. Tim, I saw the other night in Stratford. Many of my consultant colleagues would come and see shows that I was in, which was amazing. Sort of expecting, rather like my Sri Lankan family, to sort of finish the evening with a kind of, but when are you going to come back to the wards? And it never came. So I felt amazingly supported. And it turns out, of course, everyone had something going on. People played for Harlequins, or played the French horn, or climbed mountains, or conducted incredible research in amazing groups. So everyone was living a sort of slightly weird sideways career, just within the boundaries of an acceptable medical landscape. So everything felt like doctoring, but, you know, everyone's as weird as me. So I did some of the Royal College of Surgeons exams, but not all. And the day came when my partially completed exams time expired. Yeah. And that really was the doorway bricking up behind you. And that's when you know that it's done. And I felt this relief, actually, because I sort of knew at that time the thought of going back was going to take me back to a place that I actually experienced in some way about an hour and a half ago when I walked in through the doors of the JR. It was the first time that I'd done that in 20 years. And the brain knows, doesn't it? The spirit knows, the body knows. I felt tense. I walked from Tindrick Hall down that long corridor. It smells the same, you know. So I was at the National, and I wrote a play while I was at the National. It's called Night Watchman, and it was going to be on in the Cottesloe, which is the smallest of the three. It's now called the Dorfman, of the three spaces there. And then a very successful show, an actually successful show, was on in the Dorfman before us. So they moved us into the scenery dock, the paint frame. And this is a picture of the play that I wrote called Night Watchman, about a woman who plays cricket for England. And this is an example of the kind of thing that wouldn't happen now in the current cultural climate of fundraising and the level of confidence that the arts sector now does not have. A successful show in the Dorfman would have led almost certainly to the cancellation of our brand new writer programme over the summer. So this is the kind of thing that when I talk to young writers and actors, I can't really show them because it's an opportunity that they probably wouldn't get. But there's another interesting thing about this which I'll come to, which is why was I chosen to write a play with no credentials? And that's to do with diversity, which is a rising challenge in our sector. Diversity as cosmetics rather than diversity as cultural shift. And then I did this. I mean, this looks like I've gone back to the health service, but this was a medical show that I was in called Critical. The giveaway is this here, which is a wildlife lens. Appropriate to me. But it's a way of getting, getting into badger dens and things like that, that our directors on Critical used to get up close and personal with trauma medicine in this show. It was a real-time medical show, successful in some ways, not wholly successful in others, but a wonderful thing to have been part of. I made it onto the poster, but this poster, the only place I saw this poster was in an underpass in Acton, in West London. So feast your eyes upon it, because this is the only time that you will have seen it. And so on it went, and it was an actor's life, and it still is. It's like putting in bathrooms. You just hope someone's going to ask you to do the next one. Bits of writing, bits of acting, bits of TV, theatre, occasionally film, although less so. And I was also working as a theatre director, and I was directing shows on the Fringe. And I was the runner-up in a directing award called the JMK Award, in which I prepared a production by a restoration writer called Thomas Otway, called Venice Preserved, some of you will know. And that led 5 years ago to me debuting as a director at the RSC, directing Venice Preserved, and here's an image from that production in the Swan. And this was a big moment really for me. It's hard enough working as an actor, but working as a director is incredibly painstaking, and you sort of spend years in the wilderness of the pub theatre, hoping that your scrappy 2-week run gets seen by the artistic director of a theatre that might give you a job. You know, hoping the bishop turns up on the one Sunday that you're up. This was the poster. Again, drawing on my very unliterary upbringing, my interest in cartoons and animation, graphic novel. This was done by a Spanish illustrator called Coke Navarro, who I subsequently worked with on a graphic novel with Jed Mercurio, who had produced The Medical Show. So that was an interesting link up. I mean, I can trace pretty much all of my acting work, and certainly all of my directing work, back to the primary Protean job. Here's a sample page. Again, this is the least literary thing you can possibly imagine publishing, but it is right in my wheelhouse. And these pages in this book were all produced on WhatsApp in conversations during the pandemic with Coke Navarro, the illustrator, who is a person who I've still never met. A person who I saw on a Zoom once after we finished the book and printed it, and we were talking about distribution. And so we produced this out of conversations and sketches, and I'm very, very proud of it. Not least because there are a couple of pages that are text pages, and this one is a spoof Lancet article about, and this is all set in a future landscape. And this article, which is dated 23/35 March, is about a new diagnosis of a deep space psychosis, which is a total invention. But I do actually have a Lancet publication, so I felt it was okay to do that. In the text of this is an invented syndrome called the Kelsey-Lightfoot syndrome, reported by Hargreaves et al. So there they are. There's Kelsey, there's Lightfoot, and there's Hargreaves. So much of what I do is the opposite of being on rails that are going to a particular destination. It's just a hustle. The whole thing is a hustle. Which is probably, for those of you who conduct research, is a familiar thing. How does work get financed? How does work get shared? Where do collaborations come from? How does money interact with ego and zeitgeist and modishness? Those are things that are very familiar in my world. And difficult things to fight, actually. But fundamentally, you end up making your own running. And as a filmmaker and director, that's what I've done for 15 years. So this is an early short film, David Haig, who many of you will know. And this was the start of 3 pieces of filmed work that were fundamentally about journeys out of aloneness, which we'll come back to in a bit. But it's you've got to ask what the hustle is about as an artist. Why are you doing it? It's not enough to just know that you can, or that you can make a play. It's what's the bit of you that you're leaving in there, and why would you bother? And I think in retrospect, and retrospection is another theme that I think we'll come to. In retrospect, my work was emerging as meditations on journeys out of aloneness, which is something that in my mid-40s I'm still trying to work out why that is. It might be a post-conflict migration question, it might be to do with growing up in a very white part of the country where there was a fundamental segregation, even though it was at a relatively low pressure. But it's hard to know what drives you as an artist sometimes. This was a film called The Half-Light. This was a film called Boy, which was screened just before Danny Boyle's opening ceremony at the London Olympics. So this is at about 10 to 8 on the day of the Olympic opening ceremony in 2012, and that's the Olympic Stadium, and this is a photo that I took of the film up on that screen. And then this is a feature film that I made in Northern Ireland in the pandemic called Ballywalter, which is about a woman who drives a taxi in Northern Ireland who starts taking a regular fare from a guy who's at the end of his marriage, who is doing a weekly stand-up comedy course. And the film is about these two people just spinning each other off the lip of depression, two people fundamentally alone, discovering each other in that aloneness. And Ballywalter is a small village on the east coast of Northern Ireland. Here's an image of the poster. So we shot it in the pandemic, so it was a very strange thing to be doing. Independent film is tightly financed as it is, but when you start spending your entire contingencies on COVID testing, masks, and separation protocols, suddenly your money is going absolutely nowhere. But we were key workers as filmmakers, which we found less and less mysterious as we all tuned into Netflix every night to stop ourselves going mad. We thought, oh yes, this does probably have to be a pipeline that stays open. But we shot this film in a very empty Northern Ireland, in pre-vaccine COVID, just around the Brexit corner. So as Northern Ireland left the island of Ireland politically, there we were. So we didn't even know whether we could get back in. But we did end up with these extraordinary empty roads. This is a freight road up the east coast of Northern Ireland. It's lorries night and day. And we ended up with this sort of world, which was perfect for the world of two people in a car. So the pandemic was a fascinating limitation and opportunity. So here's a quick picture round. What do these things all have in common? There's that. There's that. There's that. And there's that. Here's a clue.
Okay.
Who's that?
Rachel.
It's Rachel. So those are all location and production shots from Breathtaking, which was the adaptation of Rachel's book that I worked with her on about a year and a half ago, that was on TV earlier this year in February, which was a 3-part adaptation of her book charting the experiences of healthcare professionals in the first 12 months of the pandemic. ITV made it at loss-making cost to themselves, as did our production company, who put all of their fees into the making of it. It was never going to be a programme that we could sell or distribute internationally. It was something that was deemed to be of public interest and necessity. And here we are on set. This is Jed Mercurio, Rachel and me, co-writers, co-producers. And I'll talk about the needs and the challenges of that, but this is an example of a build. Everything you see here was put in. This is an old university building in north of Belfast, and walls were taken out here. These used to be offices. There used to be windows on this wall here. Everything that you can see there, floors, ceilings, walls, equipment, everything was brought in and installed. That's a set. This is an example of a find. So this is the same building. It's giving big NHS vibes. but this is a university building. So we dressed the centre of that with some seating, and it became the kind of main drag of our hospital. There was a little kind of League of Friends situation up to the left, some signage, and away you go. And this is an example, I think immaculate example, of set dressing. And in here are some copies of, recognise the spine? Journal of Physiology. Amazingly, from the year that I did my finals. So I thumbed through and I thought, I recognise some of these papers from back in the day, just to prove that I was reading them. So every item there is brought in by a scenic artist and set dresser. The weird glass bowl, the funny little scrolly thing. This is again in the corner of a room that was just an empty room. So the level of detailing was completely extraordinary. Designer Ashley Jeffers and costume designer Kathy Pryor. And this is the outside of the building, very reminiscent of teaching hospitals of a vintage. And one of those rare examples where you can just turn the camera on, and with a little bit of signage and a bit of something else, you are outside Norfolk Park, or you're outside Waxham Park. And that level of detail was an absolute must for Rachel, and for all of us really. But this is Rachel taking a picture inside our set. So if you have a look, you can see where something's been drilled out there, where some blue tack has been left on the wall, where the door frame has been scuffed. There was no door frame, there was no wall. All of that was put in, painted, damaged, because the camera sort of sees it, even on a flyby. The camera sees the age of something, it sees its decay, it sees where the money hasn't gone. And this was Rachel's first day on set, and she was absolutely dazzled that the level of authenticity that we required had been so brilliantly achieved. This is Tom Petty, who is currently in my production of Twelfth Night at the Royal Shakespeare Company. He's a consultant anaesthetist, and he works as the lead medical advisor on this. Unusually, we brought him in early on in prep, so he was involved in the process of designing the environments. We're now in an A&E, we're now in an ED here. Again, a total build. Everything there you see has been brought in, including the hung ceiling. The crash barriers on the walls through that doorway, everything. So he was there with us in prep, he was there every day of the shoot, and there in post as well, listening to hundreds and hundreds of sounds to make sure that everything sounded right. And between him and Rachel, they policed the accuracy of the programme, because of course we live in a climate where a single inaccuracy can discredit an entire show. So it's an interesting role for a medical professional who is also an actor. And Tom was invaluable, as was Rachel, of course, to Joe Froggatt, who played the lead, who, when we screened the programme at BAFTA, healthcare professionals of all denominations felt that she was absolutely plumb authentic for an acute general medicine consultant in the present moment. So actors can be doctors, doctors can be actors. It feels like a complicated, weird, Brownian thing. So yes, here's Rumi again. This was actually from the set of Breathtaking. This was on a whiteboard in our ED department, and it was the most dazzling piece of production design I think I've ever seen, that someone had written that on a whiteboard on set. Probably to never be seen, but to somehow be part of the landscape of that programme. And this is an Instagram post by Stephanie Street, who is an actor, and this is Stephanie playing Joe Alba, who is an A&E consultant in the show. So, yeah. I think the question that we were all asking as medical students is, what will I be? Where will I go? Here's a confession. When I was 16, I wanted to be an architect. And someone a careers advisor told me I had to be good at physics, and I bottled it, and I thought, what else is scientific, socially facing, part of the world that we all live in, and that was medicine. But I don't think we really know, do we, when we're 16, what our career is going to be. I think we sort of get a sense of it at the end of it, what it was. There's a weird sort of quantum physics to the whole thing, where we understand it in this sort of time going backwards way. But some people do sense things about us, don't they, when we're growing up. And I think Tim, Martin, Peggy, Trevor were all deeply suspicious of me long before I was planning on leaving, but in the warmest possible way. And as was a primary school teacher who first put me in a school play. Very quiet, nerdy little boy who'd never really been interested in speaking up, much less being in a play. And she came to see Venice Preserves at the RSC. And she wagged her finger at me. She went, "I always knew about you." So I feel like a lot of people knew about me before I knew about myself. But maybe that's just the way of things. So I'm hugely grateful for the support, because it's quite a weird thing leaving the health service. And I sort of expected again that another series of walls and doorways would brick up, and that I would be a kind of persona non grata at best, and at worst just completely forgotten. So it's a huge honour to be back here to talk to you about it. Here's a question that I get asked a lot: why did you leave a stable job? And the answer is really to do with where the risk is in a life that you think you're going to find challenging in emotional and personal ways, that you feel like you might not be able to cope with or something. And people say, how can you go on stage? How can you go on stage for 400 quid a week in front of 1,000 people? And I think, well, that's a risk profile that I can manage. And I can stay very calm in, actually. But I can't manage a bleep at 2 a.m, is what I discovered, when I don't know what the answer is. And I still have a kind of an acoustic hyper-awareness, actually, when my baby wakes up in the night. I jump. So, the body really remembers. But this is Michael Foxton, who wrote a seminal book, Bedside Stories, about his experiences junior doctoring in the 90s, in the 110-hour weeks. And this is him saying, if you really can't do it, don't live in that fear that your life will be over at the age of 27. Reclaim your life, have it over again. You're young, you'll make new friends. It's a good soundtrack. So the risk is sometimes in staying, not going, which is a difficult thing to know if it isn't applying to you, but a very easy thing to know if it is. And people say, was it a difficult decision to leave medicine? And I kind of think, well, it was actually the easiest thing. The difficult thing was recognising that a thing that I'd worked for 10 years was something that it turned out I wasn't really that well suited to, just from an operational, practical point of view. So I'm now visiting fellow at New College, which is a huge booking error. And they made Will Poole, who is the senior tutor, when he got in contact to ask me about it, I said, well, look, I've really not done anything academic for years. And he said, I just want to assure you this is a non-academic post. So I'm there to talk to the students about what a career might or might not be, and how they might or might not do things that are of interest to them, or how they might navigate the questions. And it's an interesting thing to go into an SCR in the middle of your career and start auditing your own life, and and it's the other interesting thing is that fellowship was an attempt by the SCR to diversify itself. So of course I'm sort of there going, Is that what that is? And it's very interesting because I used to just sort of be like, well, I won't engage if those are the terms. 10 years ago, when people would ask me to do panels and things, I said, I don't want that to be the terms under which I am articulating with this institutional space. But now I think, what is the question that I can answer in that space? So if I am, fine, but for who, and what's the cost, and what's the benefit? There's a very interesting document that came out of the Barbican a few years ago when they had an enormous upheaval post-George Floyd, in which the staff published a book online anonymously of all of the instances of racism and racial harassment that took place at the Barbican. And the foreword of that document has this wonderful line in it, which is, there can be no change without the institutional feeling of loss. So at New College, I'm interested in pushing on that question. What is the nature of the loss that can be felt in order that a landscape is reordered or flattened? These are questions that you're only passing through, the things that take decades to work through and to even understand what they are. But I work increasingly in governance. I'm the vice chair of the National Youth Theatre as well, and these are questions that preoccupy me, so that I don't go to work at the RSC and think, am I only here because I'm brown? Is there a ledger somewhere that sort of says we sort of need to look a bit better than this, who's around? And it's a hard sort of demon to get off your shoulder. So the question is, should you just live in that space, or do you provide the interrogation that might actually ultimately be your own downfall? Don't know. It's really complicated, but you very quickly get a sense of when you've outlived your usefulness to an institution in the arts, which is quite grim. So these are instances of my name being spelled wrong. This is the side of the National Theatre. This is, I think that's in some magazine that I shouldn't have been in. But and there's this is a congratulations first night card from the Donmar Warehouse, printed on laminated card. And at no point did anyone think we should probably just check and see how we spell that guy's name. But they come for you almost as soon as you arrive for your equal opportunities form. So there we go. This is a shot from The Crown, playing Martin Bashir in slightly less hairy times. Yes, to whom should I complain, Isabella from Measure for Measure, is a question that is live in the second half of my career. Are theatrical institutions, arts institutions, able to continue drawing funding on the basis of a kind of fake diversification that may or not be of value to them or important to them? It's an interesting question, and I don't think it's one that will see an answer in my lifetime. But pushing gently but consistently in a sort of geological way is the tactic of this decade of my life. So yes, and here's a final resonance back at the Royal Shakespeare Company, doing Twelfth Night again, and thankfully a very different production. Sam West and Gwyneth Keyworth. An apple cleft in twain is not more twin than these two creatures. So it's on until January the 18th. Don't know how that got in there. So maybe it's just this. Maybe it's just what we're doing while we're getting through. I mean, there are 30 people in the room. There'll be 30 fundamentally different careers in this room, and I'm probably not the outlier. actually. And if you think back, how many of you thought when you started you'd have the career that you ended up with? You know, when you sort of go, oh, I'm doing 3 PAs in general medicine, I have a tropical medicine clinic, and I lecture here. You know, it ends up following you, doesn't it, in where you're blooming to. So, you know, we were obsessed with the arrival place as students. We were sort of the most insightful provocation, I think, that we thought we'd been given was look at the consultant whose life you want and do that specialty. How weird is that? What do you know about their life? What do you know about what they feel about their life? And it was the big Duplo blocks of that life. It was how often are they on call? Do they seem nice on the ward round? All of those sorts of things. It was a destination-based interrogation. And there were occasional seminars on, you know, someone who would like to climb a mountain who'd come in and say, yes, it's quite hard, you sort of have to do GP or A&E, otherwise, you know, you can't, you know. Whereas nowadays, I had a conversation with a contemporary of mine who is in Leicester, and they run a course in their postgraduate deanery for people considering leaving training. And they do seminars, and they open up the conversation. And I think it was interesting talking to him because he said it's not a given that people who attend the course leave. They just need to know that they can talk about the realities that they're faced with rather than what is this flag on a hill that we all must tread to. So yes, it feels like, you know, careers are climate rather than weather, I think, and they are journeys happening backwards in some way. I'm less aware of what I'm doing now than I was 5 years ago, even, or 10 years ago. But I'm happy to say that I love what I do, which is maybe all there is. So thank you very much for listening.
That was amazing and exhausting. Prasanna, brilliant, lovely, exceptional. We have got a few medical students. We've got Louis, can you stand up? Because new president knows the house.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. My name's Louis. I'm a fifth year medical student, and I'm this year's president of the house. It's very nice to see all of you here. I'd love to have a chat with anyone who wants to chat afterwards. So thank you very much.
Does anybody, hello to the people on Zoom, but does anybody have any questions? If you do, please speak loudly, and then Prasanna, please can you repeat?
Repeat the question, yeah.
Thank you. God, Tony.
Thank you very much, Prasanna. You're doing all these different things, writing, acting, directing. Is that because that's the way to pay the bills, or in other words, is there one of those that you like to do best and that in the ideal world you would only do?
Well, it's the first thing, really. Taken together, they constitute a set of bills paid, and I'm currently unemployed. So I'm doing an audio book in June. I'm recording a Le Carré novel. But other than that, it's a long way to the next tax bill. So I need to run a number of different horses. Yeah, and they all have different timescales. So I knew that I was directing this production at the Royal Shakespeare Company over a year and a half ago, whereas the last acting job I did, I got offered it a week before I went to Manchester for 4 days. So none of it makes any sense. I think at heart I'm a director, really. I think there's, but I think directing and acting are as different as cooking and dancing. I said the other day, but Tim heard me say that. I honestly do feel that they have so little in common. Acting is about forming one cog as well as you can and turning it as cleanly as you can. And acting is about a whole machine. Directing is about a whole story. It's about a whole machine. So you know, it's they nourish different sides of me creatively, but also they, you know, it's a tough life as a theatre director. You know, you've got to do a big production 4 or 5 times a year to make it work, and it's hard enough doing one. So yeah, you have to kind of spread bet a little bit. Yeah.
Can I ask? I'm guessing you probably gave up your GMC registration, and